All right, so are you ready to dive into some serious Reddit drama today?
Always ready for that.
You know, the kind that makes you think, am I the asshole?
Oh yeah, the AITA subreddit.
Exactly. We're looking at one that really blew up on there.
Hmm.
It's about a woman, recently a single parent, you see. Her ex-husband died in a car accident.
Oh wow.
And, well, they were divorced.
Oh.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
The ex-father-in-law calls her up and says she and the kids aren't welcome at the funeral.
Wow.
It's in Maryland. That's where the family's from.
Hmm.
He says there'll be a distraction.
Wow, that's harsh.
So we're going to try to figure that out, like what's going on there, really.
Yeah.
And of course, all the legal stuff that comes up with this kind of thing, plus, you know, the bigger issues of grief and family and then inheritance, too.
Well, this case is fascinating. It touches on so many things everyone deals with at some point.
Yeah.
Like losing someone, dealing with family,
Mm.
and then all the legal stuff will probate.
Yeah, probate. It's all playing out on Reddit, too.
Right.
Everyone weighing in and giving advice and judging.
It really shows how the internet can be good and bad at the same time.
Yeah, totally. Like support, but also people just get so opinionated.
Absolutely.
So, okay, let's give everyone the background here.
Yeah.
The original poster, we'll just say OP.
Sure.
She lays it all out in her post.
Sure.
There was a viewing in Texas where they lived,
Mm-hmm.
but the funeral's in Maryland where his family is.
Got it.
And so, like I said, the ex-father-in-law, he just calls her up and says, nope, you're not invited.
Why?
He even said, like, well, I gave you a nice service here in Texas. Like, that makes up for it.
I mean, it's got to be hard for her, right? She's grieving, suddenly a single parent.
Mm-hmm. And then there's all the legal and financial stuff on top of it all.
Yeah, exactly.
And the Reddit comments, they're all over the place.
I bet.
Some are saying he's the jerk, you know, for being so dismissive of her and the kids.
Yeah, makes sense.
Especially the kids. They're his grandkids.
Mm.
Then others are saying maybe he has an ulterior motive.
Oh, like what?
Like he's trying to cut them out of inheriting anything.
Well, it's tough to say without knowing more.
Yeah.
Like, is there even a will? But usually, kids have a right to inherit from their parents, even if they're divorced.
That's good. But what if he tries to, I don't know, hide stuff or make it difficult for her?
Oh, that's where a lawyer comes in.
Yeah.
A lot of the Redditors are saying she needs a probate attorney. And, like, fast.
Probate attorney.
Yeah, so probate basically figures out who gets what when someone dies, legally speaking.
Okay.
And it can be really complicated, blended families, you know, kids from different marriages and all that.
So it sounds like she definitely needs to get legal advice.
Absolutely. Protect your kids' interests, for sure.
Yeah. What do you think?
100%. And not just the kids, for herself too, right? There's a big change in her life.
Right.
She needs to know what's what legally and financially so she can make good decisions.
Yeah, for sure. It seems like being prepared is super important here, like having a will and stuff.
You got it. You just never know what will happen. And will makes things so much easier if something does.
Okay, so we talked about the legal stuff, but what about the kids emotionally?
Right.
The Redditors are really worried about them being excluded from the funeral,
Yeah, I can see that.
saying it could really mess them up.
Well, kids grieve differently, and funerals can be a big part of that process.
Yeah.
It's a chance to say goodbye, see others who are sad too, and try to understand what happened.
Yeah.
Being kept away from that could definitely have an effect.
And so many comments are from people sharing their own stories about family drama after someone dies. Seems like this happens more than we think.
It does. Death can bring out the worst in people, and sometimes families who already have issues, they just fall apart when dealing with a loss.
So, okay, we've got this mom who's grieving, disinvited from the funeral, and maybe the in-laws are shady. Plus, Reddit is divided on what to do, and there are so many legal and emotional questions.
Lots to unpack here.
Where do we even go from here?
Well, I think the next step is to really dig into the legal and financial questions.
Okay.
We talked probate, but there's also life insurance and then Social Security benefits for the kids.
Right.
Those are important for the OP to understand, so she knows what to do for herself and her kids.
Makes sense. And we can't forget the ethical stuff either.
Of course.
Is the ex-father-in-law really thinking of his grandkids, or is there something else going on?
Yeah?
And can the OP even defy him and take the kids to the funeral anyway?
Lots to discuss.
So much to discuss. Let's get into it.
Okay, so let's dive into the legal and financial side of all this.
Okay.
This stuff can be confusing, so we'll try to make it clear.
Yeah, please.
First off, you're probably wondering, what is probate? Well, it's what happens legally after someone dies.
Okay.
It's the process of figuring out who gets what from the person's estate.
So, like, who gets their house, car, money?
Exactly. And when someone dies without a will, it's called intestate.
Okay.
Things get a bit more tricky then, because the state laws where they lived decide how their stuff gets split up.
Got it.
And in this case, since the ex-husband lived in Texas, Texas law applies.
So, under Texas law, do the kids still inherit from their dad, even though he and the OP were divorced?
Yes, Texas law is clear on that. Kids have a right to inherit from their parents, divorced or not.
Okay, good to know. But what if the ex-father-in-law tries to, you know, hide assets or mess with the probate process? Like, a lot of the Reddit comments are suggesting that she talks to a lawyer ASAP.
Those Redditors are giving good advice. A probate attorney can be a lifesaver in situations like this.
Okay.
They know all the legal ins and outs and can ensure everything's done properly.
Right.
Plus, they can investigate any potential wrongdoing and fight to make sure the kids receive what they're legally entitled to.
That's a huge relief, honestly. Now, what about the life insurance money that's been mentioned a lot in the comments? Could the ex-father-in-law somehow get a hold of that?
That's a great question. Usually, life insurance payouts aren't part of the probate estate.
Okay.
They go straight to whoever is named as the beneficiary on the policy.
And the OP did say in her post that she is the beneficiary?
Right, so he wouldn't have any control over that money. It would go directly to her.
That's good. But are there ever situations where those payouts could cause problems within the family, even though it's not part of the estate?
Oh, absolutely. You know, money, especially a big sum like that, can create tension. Even if he can't legally touch it, there's always the chance he might try to pressure her into sharing.
Right.
Or try to guilt trip her into using it in a way that benefits him.
Yeah. So even if everything's okay legally, there's still potential for conflict there, especially with someone who seems to like pushing buttons like this.
Exactly. And speaking of money matters, the Redditors are also advising her to look into Social Security survivor benefits for the kids. Those can be really helpful when a parent passes away.
Yeah, I've heard of those, but I don't really know how they work. Can you break that down for me?
Sure. Basically, they're monthly payments from the government for children who've lost a parent who worked and paid into Social Security.
Okay.
These benefits help cover essential needs like food, clothing, shelter, and can even assist with education expenses.
Wow, that sounds incredibly helpful, especially for someone who suddenly needs to figure out finances on their own.
Absolutely, it can be a real lifesaver,
Mhm.
and it's definitely something she should look into as soon as possible.
All right, so we've covered probate, life insurance, and Social Security benefits. It feels like I'm getting a crash course in estate planning.
Huh.
But let's shift gears for a bit and talk about the ethics involved here.
Yeah.
Do you think the ex-father-in-law is morally in the right to try to keep his grandchildren from attending their own father's funeral?
This is where things get a lot harder to figure out. We're dealing with grief, family dynamics, cultural norms, personal beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
There's no single right way to handle something like this.
You can definitely tell by those Reddit comments there are a lot of different opinions out there. Some people think he's being incredibly selfish, putting his feelings above the kids' need to grieve and say goodbye to their dad.
And, they do have a point. Funerals are rituals for healing, closure, especially for children. Denying them that could be really harmful, even if he doesn't mean for it to be.
Right, right. On the other hand, some comments are trying to see things from his side, saying maybe he's just so overwhelmed with grief himself that he's not thinking straight.
That's possible too. Grief affects everyone differently, and
Yeah.
sometimes people make decisions they wouldn't normally, you
Yeah.
know. It doesn't make it okay, but it might explain it.
So how do you balance those two perspectives, the kids' need for closure and their right to say goodbye versus the possibility that he's just acting out of pain?
It's tough, isn't it? It really shows how complex family dynamics can be, especially when everyone's grieving. Sometimes there aren't easy answers and everyone's hurting in different ways.
And let's not forget, we're only hearing one side of the story here, the OP's side. We don't know what's going on in the ex-father-in-law's head or what his reasons are. We're essentially trying to piece together a puzzle with only half the pieces.
That's a really important point to remember. We're kind of like detectives here, trying to make sense of the limited information we have.
It's like a real-life drama, but with real emotions involved.
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. It makes us think critically, consider multiple perspectives, and recognize that sometimes there isn't a clear-cut good guy or bad guy in these situations.
We're all human, we all make mistakes, and we all grieve differently.
Exactly. And sometimes those differences clash, especially within families.
Okay, so we've talked about the legal stuff, the money stuff, and the ethics of it all. So for our listeners, what can they take away from this? What's relevant to their own lives?
I think one of the most important takeaways here is the need for communication and empathy within families, especially during times of loss.
That sounds great, but how do you actually do that when everyone's emotions are running high and they're all stressed out?
It's not easy, that's for sure. But it starts with trying to understand each other's viewpoints, acknowledging each other's pain, and finding a way to move forward that puts everyone's well-being first, especially the children's.
It's easier said than done, right?
Oh, for sure. But even small attempts to communicate and try to understand each other can prevent things from spiraling into huge conflicts.
And any practical tips, something concrete our listeners can do?
You hit the nail on the head before with the whole wills thing.
Oh,
Being legally prepared is so important. Having a will in place can prevent so much headache and confusion for everyone down the line.
good advice. And reading those Reddit comments, it's amazing how many people share their own experiences with similar family dramas. It seems like this happens a lot more than we realize.
It does, and death and inheritance often bring out both the best and worst in people. It's an emotional time, and old issues can come back to the surface, sometimes with really bad results.
So, for someone who finds themselves in a situation like the OP's dealing with a loss, a difficult family member, and all the legal and financial stuff, what would you advise them to do?
First and foremost, talk to a lawyer.
Okay.
A probate attorney can guide you through all the legal stuff and make sure your interests are protected.
And what else?
Remember that you're not alone.
Yeah.
There are resources out there, support groups, therapists who specialize in grief and family issues. Don't hesitate to reach out for help.
And in the specific case, what about the funeral? Should the OP go against what the ex-father-in-law wants and take her kids, even if it means more conflict?
That's a really personal decision, and there's no easy answer.
Yeah.
It depends on the specifics of the situation, the kids' ages and what they want, and how the OP thinks it'll affect them emotionally.
Tough call, but at the end of the day, it's her decision to make.
Exactly. She's their mom, and she needs to do what she believes is best for them. But even if she decides not to go to the funeral in Maryland, there are other ways to honor her ex-husband's memory and help her kids grieve.
Like what?
They could have their own little memorial service, plant a tree in his memory, create a scrapbook with photos and stories, or even just talk about him and share memories. There are lots of ways to grieve and remember someone. It doesn't have to be a formal funeral.
That's a good point. Grief is different for everyone.
For sure. And sometimes finding your own way to grieve can be more healing than trying to do what others expect.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot, but I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, the power of the internet.
Mhm.
It's fascinating how these online spaces, like the AITA subreddit, become like a sounding board for real-life problems.
It really is how complete strangers are willing to offer advice, support, even resources. It shows a kind of digital empathy, this desire to help others, even if it's just through a screen.
Yeah, and it's not just general advice either. They're getting into the nitty-gritty, sharing legal resources, links to government websites, personal stories about going through something similar. It's almost like a giant online support system.
In a way, it is. It really shows how the internet can be a powerful tool for connecting and sharing information. Of course, you have to be careful because not all advice is good advice. And it's still important to double-check things and get professional help when needed.
Right, right. Definitely a reminder to be cautious about what you read online. There's a lot of misinformation out there, so double-checking sources and getting expert advice when needed is crucial.
Couldn't agree more. The internet's a great tool, but it can't replace real legal or financial advice from qualified professionals.
Okay, so we've looked at the legal side, the money side, the ethical dilemmas, and even the societal aspect of it all.
Right.
But in the end, it all boils down to this woman, the OP, and the tough choices she has to make.
It's a good reminder that even with all the information we have online, real life is messy and complicated and sometimes just plain sad.
And no website or algorithm can tell us the right way to deal with these challenges.
Exactly. We need empathy, critical thinking, and the ability to understand that people's emotions and relationships are complex.
Okay, as we wrap up this part of the deep dive, I have a question for you listening. What would you do if you were in the OP's shoes? Would you take your kids to the funeral, even if it meant more conflict? Would you prioritize securing their inheritance? Would you try to talk to the ex-father-in-law and see things from his side? There are no easy answers, but by thinking about these questions, by discussing them, and by trying to understand everyone involved, maybe we can learn to handle these tough situations with more compassion and understanding. It really makes you think, huh,
Yeah,
this whole thing is like a lesson in, I don't know, grief and family drama and legal stuff all at once.
it is. And it's a reminder that, these viral Reddit posts,
Yeah.
the AITA dilemmas,
Yeah.
there are real people behind them, with
Yeah.
real feelings, and their situations are complicated.
And it's so easy to just get caught up in the drama of it all, you know?
Right.
Like who's right, who's wrong. But this is really a story about loss and family, about how messy life can be.
Absolutely. That's what makes these deep dives so important. It's not just about being entertained or judging people.
Yeah.
It's about trying to understand why people do things, how grief works, and how important empathy is.
I keep thinking about the kids in all this, stuck in the middle of the grown-up problems.
It's got to be so hard for them. And kids are the ones who need the most help in these situations.
Mm-hmm.
They need things to be stable, they need support, and they need to feel safe, especially when they're grieving.
So if we're just watching this unfold, what can we even do to help kids like that?
Well, we can't fix things for them, but we can be aware of what they need.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to talk to kids about their grief, even if it's hard.
It's tough, yeah.
Listen to them, let them know their feelings are okay, and make sure they know it's all right to feel sad or mad or confused or anything.
I guess it's all about letting them know it's okay to feel whatever they feel, and they have someone to talk to.
Exactly. And even if you're not a parent or close family, you can still help. Help out the adults taking care of them. Offer to run errands, watch the kids for a bit, bring over some food.
Yeah, that can make a difference. And I guess the same goes for the adults in this situation too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like just being there for them, understanding, not judging too quickly.
Exactly. We talk about how grief affects everyone differently. Sometimes people act out or make bad choices. It doesn't make it right, but we can try to understand.
So maybe instead of pointing fingers, we should focus on helping everyone involved.
I think that's a really good lesson from all of this. Empathy is so important.
Yeah.
We might not always agree with what people do or understand how they're feeling, but we can try to be kind and listen.
That's good advice for, well, not just this Reddit thing, but life in general.
It really is.
The world would be a better place if we were all a little nicer to each other. So we've talked about a lot today. Legal stuff, money, ethics, even how all this plays out in our society. But it all comes back to this woman and the incredibly tough choices she's got to make.
It reminds us that even with all the information and opinions out there, life is messy, complicated, and sometimes it just hurts.
And there's no easy answer. No one can tell us the right thing to do.
Nope, it takes empathy and thinking critically and realizing that people's emotions and relationships are complicated.
Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive, but before we go, I want to leave you with this thought. Next time you see a story like this, whether it's on Reddit or the news or even in your own life, remember that there's always more to it than we see at first. Try to think about what everyone's going through, realize that feelings are complex, and offer compassion instead of judgment.
And remember, you're not alone. There's help out there if you need it, people who care, and places you can turn to.
And with that, we'll leave you to think about everything we discussed today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.